Meniere's disease is a disorder of the inner ear. The what, you say?
Great question, I would love to tell you.
The ear has three sections. The outer ear, which is the fleshy bit and the tube. The middle ear, which is the eardrum and the tiny little ear bones. And the inner ear, which is like a balloon animal inside the skull, the shape of a snail shell, and some loop-de-loops. So, Meniere's disease. In there. The inner ear is filled with fluids, and when someone suffers from an episode of Meniere's, suddenly that space swells up with a lot more fluid. This causes some pressure issues because, as I mentioned before, the inner ear has walls of bone, and bone doesn't really stretch or compress very well, but you know what does? All the tiny fragile sensory organs in the snail shell and the loop-de-loops. Because those organs sense sound and gravity, this causes intense attacks of vertigo, nausea, hearing loss, pressure in the ears, and that ringing sound, tinnitus. What causes this, you may ask? Well, we haven't figured that out yet. In 1929, a lady named Dita Dederding, who had Meniere's, fun fact, wrote a lengthy manuscript proposing that the cause was to do with poor water metabolism, and that if we have less water in our system at rest, then maybe we'll have less water pressure when an attack comes on. At the time, there were medications that can reduce fluids in the body, but in her experience, she didn't think medications were good for you long term, and proposed reducing salt and fluids through diet instead. Today, we call that dehydration. Albert Furstenberg recognized that maybe dehydration wasn't a great long-term plan for people with chronic illness, but he did like the reduced salt idea. First, he put 15 patients on a diet of only 2 grams of salt a day, which is a teaspoon. And then later he thought, maybe my sample size is a little bit small. It was. And he repeated this test with 150 patients, and then asked them to compare their symptoms from before the diet to after the diet, thus producing the first results supporting salt reduction as a treatment for Meniere's disease with much aplomb from his medical and scientific community. 51 years later, a gentleman named John Keyes started asking some pretty important questions and pointing out that some of these studies are plagued with major scientific biases. There isn't one clear medical definition for Meniere's disease, and there's no baseline symptoms to compare against. Also, most of the early studies supporting this treatment didn't use control groups. Studies were usually low quality, with sample sizes too small, little follow-up, no control group, and lacked high-quality evidence. Robust literature reviews by this guy Ruckstein suggested that no compelling evidence for salt restriction as a treatment for Meniere's disease exists, and the Cochrane Institute did a thorough scraping of many databases to test the strength of 363 different records to not find a single one they could include as base data to meet the standards of a randomized control trial. Not one. This was in 2018, and there have since been other scientists who have tried to answer the desperate call for good data, like this one in 2024, that at least has a control group of equal size to the test group, despite it still being statistically very small. And this one that at least identified that reducing salt does cause a marked change in a hormone that may increase absorption of fluids in the ear. This study even had 2 years worth of tracking and follow-up. But it's still just correlation and not causation. There are too many unchecked variables. Patients don't stick to their diets. They don't know how. There's errors in the way we record changes in symptoms. There's errors in what we define as symptoms. Most studies are basically getting qualitative data and trying to make quantitative leaps with it. As the Cochrane Systematic Review stated, there simply isn't enough clear quality data to confirm or deny if this treatment actually does anything. So the moral of the story is to take everything you read with a grain of salt, or not?